know that DNA tests can be used to map out a treatment protocol for autism. There is a strong connection between the genes our kids have and environmental expression of their genes. Today, I'm going to discuss with Dr. Woeller from the USA how we can personalize a treatment protocol for a child on the spectrum based on their genes. This is just absolutely amazing. It is important to note, though, that as important as this DNA analysis test can be, this test should be used as complementary information. It is always important to focus on healthy eating and digestive assessment for yeast and bacterial problems in autism. The organic acid test from Great Plains Laboratory covers 72 markers, including inflammation, bacterial and yeast overgrowth, and nutritional deficiencies. But today, we are fortunate to be chatting to Dr. Woeller from the Autism Recovery System about the genomic testing, the gene testing, DNA analysis, and how this fits in to mapping out a treatment protocol for a child with autism. Welcome, Dr. Woeller.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
So it is is this a difficult test to perform? You know, what does it entail and how do you collect the sample for this DNA analysis testing? Is there a specific age that the child has to be to take this test?
As far as age, I don't know of any age restriction, right? So the genetics are the genetics, that's what they are once you're born. So I mean, if you look at kids who appear to have metabolic or genetic disorders, they can test for those at a very, very early age. So there's no age restriction that I know of specifically in general. A specific lab might have some recommendations. Typically, most of these tests, these what are called genomic tests, are they take a swab off the oral mucosa, so they call it a buccal swab. So they're very easy to collect, and they give a graphic representation essentially of underlying genetic patterns. You're not necessarily identifying genetic diseases sometimes, which gets to be a little bit more sophisticated, but what we're typically looking at on these genomic profiles is patterns that might indicate some kind of tendency to a biochemical or metabolic imbalance, for example.
I remember when I conducted this test for my youngest son, Aaron, I think he must have been 22 months. And I actually used an empty syringe, and I took the syringe, I placed the syringe under his tongue, and I drew up the saliva because the test kit I used needed quite a bit of saliva. I don't know what this test is like. And I remember thinking, how on earth am I going to get this saliva? Because, you know, a child on the spectrum can't always spit. If you just tell them to spit and you need like saliva, sounds like the lab you use just uses a swab. But I remember very clearly that I used a syringe to actually extract the saliva under the tongue when I collected the saliva for my son to conduct this testing. I also remember unpacking this test with you. You know, that's about 7 years ago. And I remember getting off the phone and feeling so excited because you'd uncovered things that we could give Aaron that would help him and treat his autism symptoms. And it actually really worked. One of the things you recommended off the analysis was simply something like folate, and we'll talk about that later. And Aaron turned his voice back on within 48 hours of starting folate supplementation. So when I say turned his voice back on, you know, he didn't just start talking in 48 hours, but he started saying a couple of sounds again. So now, you've mentioned the max function test from MaxGen Labs in Texas. I know in South Africa, we've got a lab called DNA Analysis, and they do a similar test. Tell us more about our basic genetics and how our basic genetics can provide information on how to treat autism.
So, I mean, genetics come down to what's happening at the cellular level, right? We're talking about DNA and RNA. So DNA is made up of what are called nucleotides, these small chemicals, and the sequence of those creates, that's essentially our DNA. That creates, depending on the combination of different nucleotides, creates a gene. And so what happens is that RNA will transcribe and translate the genetic information. And then from that transcription, we develop different proteins in the body. That could be a protein for your muscle, that could be a protein for your brain, that could be a protein for your immune system. So when they talk about the genetic code, it's essentially a blueprint of information that then gets read and translated or transcribed by our RNA to form different proteins. And so that's kind of how our body functions. So these tests are analyzing for different genetic sequences that are linked to different genes that have a control mechanism or an influence over different biochemical systems in our body. So let's take, for example, MTHFR. Most people have heard of that. And that's an enzyme. MTHFR is an enzyme that helps to convert different forms of folate. So most of us have heard of folic acid, okay, because it's found in many supplements. And here in the United States, they put folic acid in a lot of foods because a deficiency of folic acid can lead to neural tube defects. Well, folic acid as a chemical is actually a synthetic derivative of folate. And there's different types of folates that we obtain from our diet. So if you eat a green leafy vegetable diet, you're generally getting adequate amounts of folate. But a lot of nutrients that we take into our body have to be converted into an active form. And so when you look at MTHFR, what it's doing is it's taking essentially relatively inactive folate within our body and converting it into an active form, a functional form that can then influence other biochemical steps along the way. So in that particular enzyme helps to, again, convert into active folate that has a tremendous influence in what's called the methylation cycle. And when we look specifically at autism, the methylation cycle is this very complicated system, has a lot of overlap to it, but at its core, a well-functioning methylation cycle will usually influence environmental awareness, eye contact, language development, immune function, detoxification, which means if there are imbalances in the methylation cycle, you could be at increased risk for language problems, for awareness issues, for other cognitive problems. And not everybody has the same thing, okay? Because there's multiple steps within some of these biochemical systems, but it's known in autism that their methylation cycle is often impaired. It may not be functioning optimally. And by the way, nobody has perfect genetics, okay? We all have something going on, okay? It's just that because of the complexity of the human body, we have the ability biochemically and metabolically to compensate for areas that might be weak. So for one person, you might have a weakness in one area, but they may have a strength in another area, and that somehow offsets any kind of imbalances. So the MTHFR is just one example of a biochemical system that can be influenced by a genetic variant in some of those genes.
I think it's amazing that we're able to test for these variations. I really enjoyed the explanation of how this blueprint of information can provide the information we need to help our kids. And I can speak from experience to say that my youngest son, Aaron, and actually my oldest, David, they both did not have a well-functioning methylation cycle. So we had to do a lot of work for both kids to actually correct that methylation cycle. I know that you recommend to parents often the New Beginnings brand. Does New Beginnings have a folate that parents can use?
Yeah, they actually have a couple. The main active form of folate is called L-methylfolate, or sometimes called methylfolate, and that's generally an active form of that nutrient. There's another form called folinic acid, which is very similar. So chemically, structurally, they're very similar. It turns out that when you look back over time and a lot of the research into folate supplementation, a lot of research was done using folinic acid. So L-methylfolate as a supplement is a little bit newer version sort of to the game, but both forms are active forms of that particular nutrient. So New Beginnings actually carries both. And we could go into a lot of different reasons of why you might use some of those. But one thing I want to say real quickly, one thing people need to understand about these tests is it provides a blueprint. And in most cases, if there is some type of genetic variant in that gene, okay, and what it typically is doing is it's decreasing the function of its respective enzymes. So for example, MTHFR, if there is a variant, usually the overall function of the enzyme is decreased. So let's just take, for example, let's say there was no variant, and we're assuming that the enzyme is working at 100% capacity, okay? Well, if there was what's called a heterozygous, variant, where there's basically one copy of that gene that came from one parent, if that was positive, you could assume that the function of that particular enzyme was decreased by about 30%. So it's working at about a 70% capacity. If you had a homozygous, which is now a defective copy essentially from both parents, well, the function of the enzyme might be decreased by 50, 60%. So it's not as though a genetic variant is going to shut down the function of that enzyme 100%, okay? There's still going to be some function, but it's just decreased in its capacity. And that's not known, by the way, for all of these enzymes. That's known for the MTHFR, but it's not like all of the genes they've been able to figure out how much gets affected. And then there are certain variants in certain cases where the genetic variant actually increases the activity of the enzyme. Those aren't as common. So it's important to understand that just because somebody tests and shows a genetic variant in a gene that's influencing an enzyme, that doesn't automatically mean that in every single case that variant is leading to some type of disorder or disease. Okay, because again, if you hyperfocus on just one or two genes, you're sort of losing, what's that old saying, losing the forest through the trees, right? Because there's a lot of other, the body is very complex, and there's a lot of other areas biochemically where things can compensate and make up for the difference. So to me, these tests give a representation of potential imbalances. But as you stated up front, Alana, you still have to get in and do the core work, working on underlying health, good nutrition, good diet, good gut function, all of those types of things. Because there are other aspects that can impact these genes as well, and that's environmental influences. So it's known that different toxins can also impede the function. So it's possible, by the way, for you, let's just take, for example, you could have no genetic variant in your MTHFR, right? But if you're being bombarded with toxins, those toxins themselves might suppress the activity of that gene. So one of the things that I've seen over the years, by the way, is many kids on the autism spectrum, we know have genetic variants that compromise methylation and maybe compromise the way they detox certain compounds or certain chemicals. And if you can improve just the overall health status, remove things environmentally, work on gut function, work on good nutrition, that many times those genetic weaknesses that might exist within their blueprint, okay, are lessened just by improving their overall health. And that's a key concept, because it's not always just about, well, what supplement can I use for this gene, or what can I do for this particular, genetic variant. It's important to understand that there are things that can be done, but my whole approach has always been, from a biomedical standpoint, is laying good foundation and good framework for health, and then using these tests to fine tune the situation. I hope that makes sense.
It made complete sense. I love how you explained that we've got the heterozygous variation, the homozygous variation, and that this test is really actually looking at potential imbalances. But then I think you so importantly explained how it doesn't help if you supplement all these things where you find these imbalances, and you're not focusing on your foundation, the child's primary health, such as their dietary intervention, and also treating that gut. So I think you did an excellent job in putting all of that across. I know that a lot of parents always ask me about vitamin D and how important this is for language. I always use an oil-based vitamin D. So can we see on this genetic analysis whether the child is actually deficient in vitamin D?
You're not going to be able to tell if they're deficient, but you can tell if they have genetic variants in certain receptors that are linked to vitamin D. So there's something called VDR, the vitamin D receptor, and there's different types. So that's the function of the receptor and how it interacts with vitamin D, which then influences biochemical activity within the cell. Okay? But that's not measuring your actual level of vitamin D in your blood. It's just saying that you may need, by the way, what it could suggest is that if you have a genetic variant in your vitamin D receptor, you as an individual might need more vitamin D to activate the same biochemical reaction in your cell compared to somebody else who doesn't have the genetic variant, but it's not measuring the actual level of vitamin D. If you want to test your vitamin D level, you actually have to do a vitamin D test. So you have the genetics, which show the potential that you might just need more, okay? But and that's it's valuable that way, but it's not measuring the actual level of vitamin D in the body. That's a separate test.
And if a child is in fact actually vitamin D deficient, what symptoms would we look out for?
There's a lot. I mean, vitamin D, gosh, it's so many levels. I mean, it's important for, bone health and musculoskeletal health, cardiovascular health, certainly important for immune function. So people who generally tend to be vitamin D deficient are more prone to viral infections. I mean, let's just take, for example, you're probably hearing more and more now that people should be taking vitamin D to help prevent against COVID, for example. So, vitamin D is important for brain and nervous system health. It's kind of interesting. One little side note with regards to vitamin D, and it gets a little bit complicated biochemically, but we all produce serotonin in our body. Okay, so most people think of serotonin as that that happy chemical. If you have enough of it, you have good mood, good sleep, etc. Well, most of the serotonin that we actually produce in our body is in our digestive system. And serotonin in our digestive system plays a role in peristaltic activity and, balancing things there. But if you get too much, it can be problematic. It can cause some irritation in the gut, for example, and other imbalances. Well, if you don't get enough serotonin in your brain and nervous system, you're going to be more prone to depression, anxiety, and sleep problems. Well, it turns out that vitamin D is one of the switches to help regulate serotonin. Lack of serotonin in the brain, for example, in autism, could be linked to language imbalances, could be linked to cognitive and attention and focusing imbalances too. So without getting into too much detail, basically, if you're vitamin D deficient, let's say you just have low levels circulating in your blood, you're at greater risk for having less serotonin in the brain and nervous system, but more serotonin in the digestive system. And it has to do with the fact that the vitamin D is an activator of the genetic gene that influences the enzymes that help make serotonin.
That was a very valuable explanation.
Yeah. So vitamin D it's very important, and so just the upshot is that what can people expect from it? Usually, people can expect improved vitality with regards to infections, overall immune function, and many times improvements in cognitive development.
Now, B12 is important for a number of processes in the body, and children with autism often feel better after they switch to the correct form of B12. Sometimes they're not taking the right form, and we can see based on their genetics what form of B12 they should be taking. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, there are various forms of B12 that have different roles biochemically, and again, we could get kind of lost into some of the subtleties of this, but the genetic profiles give a guide as to which type of B12 may be most beneficial. And the reason I say guide is that ultimately the real guide a lot of times when it comes to supplements is how an individual actually responds to that supplements. So the genetic profiles give a representation of maybe which way to go and which type to use. So for example, in the autism world, methyl B12, what's called methylcobalamin, is a very versatile form of B12. And it has one known biochemical function, at least that's known, in that it helps to convert within the methylation cycle something called homocysteine and converts it to methionine. And it's active within a very important enzyme complex called methionine synthase. Now, by the way, methionine synthase is dependent on active forms of folate. So L-methylfolate and folinic acid can help support methionine synthase. So basically what methyl B12 does is it helps to speed up or accentuate the conversion of that initial step in methylation. And that's its primary goal. That's its primary role, for example. That's what it's doing. And that's a very important part of it. There are other B12s. You've got hydroxy B12, adenosyl B12, which can have other influences on how the cell, generates energy production, mitochondrial activity, for example. When you look at autistic individuals, whether they're children, teenagers, or adults, in the vast majority, we know have some imbalance or various imbalances in the methylation cycle. So there's a number of different steps. And so by and large, most individuals with autism tend to fare pretty well with methyl B12 because it gets that methylation, that first step, working pretty well. And that's something that I've experienced over the years in using methyl B12 injections or nasal methyl B12, for example. And that often translates into improved eye contact, environmental awareness, many times improvements in socialization, just becoming more connected. And so when I look at things genetically and I look at things functionally, there's things that generally tend to help the vast majority of times. Now, but let me just finish on one thought, Ilani. I think you'll find this interesting. In that, let's go back to the scenario that I talked about early on, in that environmental factors can also impact the function of our genetics. This is what's called epigenetics. Well, a perfect example of this is that in autism, we know that many of these kids have underlying yeast issues, bacterial problems. They could have been exposed to heavy metals. They could be exposed to environmental chemicals. Well, a lot of us can be exposed to those things. So these things aren't necessarily unique to autism. It just turns out that autistic individuals in general tend to be more sensitive to the existence of these toxins. Well, the methylation cycle can actually be impaired because of these epigenetic factors, because of these environmental factors. And I've actually had situations where I've given methyl B12 and it didn't work the way I expected it to, even though the genetics kind of said, hey, we got a problem here. And it wasn't until I went back and started working again on gut function, working on yeast and bacterial toxins, getting environmental chemicals reduced, basically lowering the level of these other environmental exposures. And once I did that, all of a sudden, the methyl B12 started working. And so that's an important concept. Okay, it goes back to the point of these genetic tests provide good information, complementary information. But we can't just focus on the genetics. We have to use it in context with the other things that we're doing biochemically. And one last thought, and I know you want to ask a question.
Carry on.
But that methionine synthase enzyme, by the way, on the genetic profiles, it's listed as MTR, MTRR. Okay. If you ever look at one of these genetic profiles, whether it's from the Max Gene Labs, whether it's from Doctor's Data, whether it's from Great Plains, they're all relatively similar. That specific enzyme complex, where that methyl B12 works and it links up with that methylfolate, that enzyme is very susceptible and vulnerable to chemical toxins, to heavy metal toxins, to candida toxins. And that's why I believe I've been seeing over the years that if I'm not getting the response to some of these methylation supplements, it's probably because we've got other environmental factors that are impeding the pathways.
I love your explanation. Absolutely. I often tell parents autism is epigenetic, and then they'll say, what did you just say? Epigenetic what? So I'm very happy for that explanation. And I'll explain that the genes were vulnerable, but it would take an environmental trigger to actually express the genetics. And then you were talking about the B12, and some parents really just don't want to give those B12 injections. So I'm glad to hear there is that nasal B12. Can they also get that from New Beginnings?
Yeah, they can get the nasal B12 from New Beginnings. It's called Methylmate. In fact, it's actually what they do with that. It's an oral, it's a liquid B12, but you can request a nasal applicator, and you put the nasal applicator, it turns it into a nasal spray.
And then your explanation of the MTR and the MTRR and methionine and how that all fits in was brilliant, because a lot of parents will say, but I gave the B12 injections and in fact he just became more hyperactive. And what you're saying is that after all your years of experience, you've realized that you actually have to go back And if the child has got toxicity in the environment, that B12 is not going to work at that point in time. Keep it as something in your back pocket that you can get back to. But clean up your child's diet and clean up your child's environment. I speak to parents and I'll say, well, what is your child eating? I can't tell you how often this happens. Well, my child won't eat, so we go to McDonald's every day and he'll only eat McDonald's burgers or Steers burgers. And what do they drink? They only drink juice. And so, you know, toxicity. And as you mentioned, if you've got candida dumping toxin, then the methyl B12 is not going to work. You've got to first clean all of that up. You've got to check for mold in the house. Is your child drinking filtered water? What soap are you using to wash the child's clothes, the bed linen? You really got to focus on cleaning up that environment. Would you agree?
I would. And I think, you know, the reality is that, and then, you know, again, this depends on the individual child, how sensitive they are and how reactive they are. It's not as though we can't do, you know, genetic support at the same time that we're, you know, working on other things, right? So we can work on diet, we can work on gut function, and, you know, you can provide some nutritional support as well to maybe in some cases accentuate the positive influences. Where people run into problems is with kids who are very, very sensitive to supplements. And they have to, you know, be much more methodical in their approach. From a fundamental level, though, you're absolutely right. Okay. And that is that for all of us, you know, if you, I mean, the perfect example is somebody runs out and spends $300-400 on a genetic test. And then they go, oh, I'm going to take these 5 supplements because it says my MTHFR is doing this, blah, 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 blah. And then they take these things and go, well, I don't feel any different, you know, but, you know, their diet's lousy, you know, they smoke, they consume too much alcohol. I'm talking in general here, right? You know, how much can we expect supplements to do to overcome, you know, a diet or a lifestyle that may not be that healthy? And this isn't claiming that parents are having unhealthy lifestyles with their kids. It's just that what I've noticed a lot is that the kids who tend to be the ones that are most sensitive, okay, to supplemental changes are those who tend to have, you know, poor detoxification capacity, but also they usually have some kind of environmental exposure. It could be mold, it could be chemicals, it could be both. It could be a lot of digestive issues, yeast problems, bacterial problems. And until we can kind of clear some of that stuff away, at least lower the load on the body, okay? It's not, you know, we're talking, we kind of have a spectrum here. There's a lot of gray area. Just lower the load. At that point is when you generally will start to see more positive changes occur with more of these targeted type of nutrients based on genetics. Okay.
So before I move on to my next question, I just wanted to ask you about activated charcoal, because sometimes when the child is reacting hyperactive to the antifungals or the antibacterials, I have heard of doctors using activated charcoal to just alleviate that die-off symptom. Tell us more about how this works.
So activated charcoal has been it's been around a long time. It's a binder. So it's commonly used to bind up poisons in the digestive tracts. And so think of it like a sponge. So it'll soak up any toxins that are in the digestive tract and prevent them from being absorbed. So if you have, let's say, yeast, and you're attacking the yeast with an antifungal medication or botanical remedy, the yeast are dying off. As they're dying off, they're releasing their internal contents. They're spilling their guts, basically. And sometimes in certain sensitive individuals, those toxins that get produced by the killing off of the yeast or bacteria can trigger die-off reactions. In some people, they can cause fevers, headache, body aches, and pains. Other times, kids get hyperactive, they get irritable. So what the activated charcoal does is it binds those toxins and prevents them from being absorbed, and then you poop them out in your stool.
It's so good to know that there is something that parents can use to counter the symptoms that their children experience when they're giving these antifungals. Now, genetic considerations for inflammation, what would these be?
Wow. So there's a lot of things. One of the things that I like about that Max Gene Labs, by the way, so that they look at certain markers that can be linked to arachidonic acid, for example, which can have pro-inflammatory effects. There's some genetics that are linked to what's called phosphatidylcholine, for example. And I right at the moment, I can't rattle them off my head, but I don't have all of them memorized. But inflammation can occur for various reasons. Certainly, there can be genetic susceptibility to inflammation. Some of the immune markers, for example, like interleukin-6 and these different types of things, can increase your susceptibility to inflammation. Okay, just because there's a genetic marker that shows, oh, I have a variant in this gene, doesn't automatically mean you have excess inflammation going on. There still has to be a trigger for it, right?
Can I ask you, right? So let's say you pick up on this test, TNF alpha, right? TNF.
Yeah.
Or the interleukin-6 you were talking about.
Yeah.
But now what about we add to this Great Plains as organic acid test where you can see quinolinic acid?
Yeah, that's a possibility. So tumor necrosis factor, interleukin-6 are immune chemicals that get produced usually in response to some type of chronic stressor. Now, that could be a chronic infection, for example. Tumor necrosis factor, for example, can not only generate inflammation and dysfunction in the gut, it can also do the same thing in the brain and nervous system. So those are often elevated when there's a lot of toxicity secondary to chronic infection or some type of autoimmune disease. Is where they're problematic. So tumor necrosis factor, for example, can actually lead to leaky gut, could also lead to a leaky blood-brain barrier. So if you have the genetic, let's say you have the genetics that are showing you that there is a genetic imbalance or variant in those markers, does that automatically mean that you as an individual have brain inflammation or neuroinflammation? Okay, it doesn't. It means that you're at a higher risk for it if you were to develop a chronic infection or have a faulty lifestyle or have environmental factors. Okay, but that doesn't automatically mean that that's happening in you. It just means that, again, your increased potential. It's kind of like saying, well, hey, Dr. Woeller, you've got 3 genes that put you at higher risk for diabetes, for example. That doesn't mean I have diabetes. It just means that if I don't exercise and don't eat well, and that I have an increased risk of developing diabetes. So that's where we can work from our lifestyle standpoint to decrease our risk. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Ilana.
You answered the question. You answered the question really, really well. So you can have a gene vulnerability, but it won't express unless there is an environmental trigger. So we can use the genetic analysis to, lessen the risk of a problem, but we would still need, let's say, like I mentioned, the organic acid test, checking for quinolinic acid, because then we've definitely got inflammation there.
Yeah. See, okay. I should be asking you these questions because you're actually doing a better job at explaining them than I am.
Not at all. Dr. Woeller, the role of histamine and allergens may guide us in treating autism symptoms. Tell us about this.
So histamine is very complex chemical, and there's a lot of influence it has, in the brain and nervous system, as well as our immune function and the way we respond to allergens, for example. And it's interesting. There's what's called DAO, okay, diamine oxide. Helps metabolize histamine that is essentially outside of our cells. Okay. So if we have a lot of histamine circulating in our bloodstream, for example, well, you're going to have, increased tendency to, let's put it in, basically increase a tendency to, leaky blood vessels and swelling and inflammation, for example. And you're also going to have an increased tendency to just a lot of food reactions, for example, that might be influencing the digestive system, where people feel like they're constantly reacting to food from an allergic standpoint. That's what DAO can do, is it helps to break down histamine externally. There's actually another enzyme called HNMT, histamine L-methyltransferase. And this is actually involved in breaking down histamine within our cells. So it turns out that many people with asthma have a defect in their HNMT enzyme. So they just have a greater tendency to react. And this is probably why they have such a high tendency to react with inflammation, specifically in their lungs. Okay. So, the role of histamine is important. So in either one of those kinds of scenarios, it basically is just putting you at increased risk for aberrant histamine metabolism. And if it's the DAO version, basically it means you just have more potential histamine around that could create, allergic reactions or digestive system imbalances.
DAO has been compromised in my oldest son, David, and I'm struggling a lot with this. I have to actually give him antihistamines on a daily basis, because I find with my oldest, no matter what he eats, and I've been on so many diets, he really reacts to just everything. But he's a lot more stable on loratadine. That's what I give him. But David's DAO is definitely compromised. Yeah. And there are periods of time where he won't eat at all. And then if I give him an antihistamine, we get his appetite back.
Yeah, his is an extreme case. That's a lot of kids aren't that sensitive. He's always been extremely. What is his HNMT? Do you know? I don't remember if that was tested or if that was on his profile.
I don't remember the result on his HNMT, but I think that's really something that I can look at again. Yeah. And I'm glad that you raise it. And you are 100% correct. David is a very, very tough case. He falls in a very small percentage of kids. And it's been very difficult to get all David's autism symptoms under control, because he's just been so compromised in so many areas. Now, my last question. A lot of our parents have heard about dopamine. COMT, COMPT on the genetic analysis, on the DNA analysis, and dopamine. How are these two connected?
Well, COMP plays a role in, it helps to break down dopamine. And so if you have a COMT variant, okay, in some cases it's fast, in some cases it's slow. But basically, if you have a slow function of the enzyme, you're going to have a potential buildup of dopamine. Okay, so it doesn't get converted, it doesn't get metabolized appropriately. And in autism, high levels of dopamine, not always, but can be linked to more aggressive behavior, more irritable behavior, sometimes self-injurious behavior. Okay, so, but a lot of times people who have, a lot of times high levels of dopamine can be more, well, they call it sort of the warrior gene, right? So they're less fearful, they're more resilient, they're more aggressive. Dopamine metabolism is complicated because it's actually controlled by a number of enzymes. So you've got COMP on one hand, but on the other side, you've got something called dopamine beta hydroxylase, which is what converts dopamine to norepinephrine. And that turns out to be a really significant problem in autism, and it's a relatively newer development. It's been around, it's just been that it's being recognized now and being able to test for it. And this does bring us back a little bit to the organic acid test. And so I know this, for probably people who are sort of new to the biomedical approach, this may be a little bit complicated, but let me just see if I can break this down. So dopamine typically gets converted to norepinephrine. Norepinephrine gets converted to epinephrine. And we need that to help spark cognitive function, memory development, attention, and focusing. But we also need norepinephrine and epinephrine for energy production in the body. We also need it to maintain adequate function of our cardiovascular system. So when you go from a lying to a standing position, right, you actually need an increase of your blood pressure. Your heart rate needs to go up because you need to maintain perfusion of blood to your brain. Otherwise, you pass out. So when people go from a seated to a standing position, they get dizzy and lightheaded. It's because there's a lag in their body's ability to compensate from a cardiovascular standpoint. Much of that is linked to the regulation of norepinephrine and epinephrine. And that enzyme, that dopamine beta hydroxylase enzyme that converts dopamine to norepinephrine, can be compromised genetically. The difficulty in this is we're talking about these genomic profiles. And some genomic tests will actually list certain genetic markers linked to the function of dopamine beta hydroxylase, but they're not exactly sure of all of the genes that control the enzyme, which one is really doing what. So in order to actually measure the activity of the dopamine beta hydroxylase, you actually have to do what's called a dopamine beta hydroxylase activity test. And that was a new test that Great Plains just came out with this past year. So it looks at the actual function of the enzyme. Okay, so that's on one hand. So if you have a problem in your dopamine beta hydroxylase, that can cause high levels of dopamine. Okay, and that can cause aggression and irritability and self-injurious behavior in autism, for example. On the other side of the equation, you have COMT, right? So COMT also helps to break down dopamine. So you can think of COMT as a regulator. It's like a pressure valve. It sort of releases the pressure off of too much dopamine building up in the pipes. And if you've got a variant in that enzyme that's slowing down its function, well, that just fills or potentially fills up more dopamine in your pipes where you can't get adequate, pressure relief. So the dopamine story, I could show you diagrams and all this, Ilana, but one of the complicating things in autism is, why do we have a dopamine problem in the first place? Is it entirely because of COMT? Is it possibly a problem in our dopamine beta hydroxylase? And both of those scenarios could be true, but do we also have a Clostridia problem? And so the last time we met, we talked about the organic acids test, right? And as you've seen with your kids, the organic acid test is that many of the kids with autism have Clostridia bacteria that shows up on the Great Plains oat. So at the bottom of page 1 is the Clostridia bacterial section. And those Clostridia toxins that are on the organic acid test are known inhibitors of dopamine beta hydroxylase. So what does that mean? If you've got a Clostridia problem that's inhibiting dopamine beta hydroxylase, that's going to increase your dopamine levels, right? So what happens in that scenario if you've got Clostridia and then you also have a COMT variant, a COMT variant that slows the function of COMT down? That's just going to compound the problem.
You're talking about a storm in a teacup now.
What's that?
I said what you're describing now is a storm in a teacup.
Right. So the genetics on dopamine are important, yes, to analyze, but it unfortunately in this particular scenario, it's not the end of the story, because if you've got Clostridia that's sitting there, that needs to be dealt with, because that could just be overwhelming the function of these metabolic enzymes, where the system just doesn't work correctly. So in all cases, right, and this is why in my practice, I never start with just a genetic test. Okay. The genetic tests to me are complementary, useful information in conjunction with other core tests, like the organic acid test, like metal testing, like food sensitivity testing. And so again, that's kind of, I think maybe a final thing here is that use the genetic test to build information, to use it as a way of analyzing your child at a deeper level, to get a better blueprint. But you also need to be looking at these tests that actually are showing you the functional status of chemical reactions.
It makes a lot of sense.
Which is what the organic acid test is all about.
Correct. It makes a lot of sense. Just a quick question. Clostridia. 3 natural remedies for Clostridia. Biocidin, or will biocidin not work? Cat's claw, colloidal silver. Give me 3 for Clostridia.
I don't have any experience with colloidal silver and Clostridia. Cat's claw, perhaps. Usually biocidin as a combination botanical tends to work pretty well, but that doesn't mean some other combination botanical, GI microbex from Designs for Health, or so a good combination botanical like that will usually be helpful. The soil-based organisms, so the Bacillus bacteria, the Bacillus clausii, the Bacillus, I'm forgetting the names now, but those probiotics. So you've got a number of them on the market. Core Biotic, for example, which comes from New Beginnings. Some people use Megaspore Biotic, which here in the United States is used a lot in the SIBO world, for example. So a good combination botanical and a Bacillus a spore biotic, biobotanical research, which actually produces the biocidin. They have something called Proflora R, and that's also good. So those are very helpful.
I love the list that you've just given us. I've actually used the Core Biotic from New Beginnings before, and it was very successful with my youngest son. Now,
the reality is, Ilana, is that most probiotics, even the different species of Lactobacillus and Bifidobacter, most of them have some anti-Clostridia capacity. So they'll all kind of get in there and kind of battle it out. What we're just finding is that clinically, it just seems like those soil-based organisms seem to do a better job at it.
I have such a problem because I can just go on and on talking to you. and never stop. You are such a wealth of information. I'm enjoying every minute of it. Like I keep on thinking, but I want to ask this question. And I know we're really getting to the end of this session, but a last question. Should we not be looking at digestive enzymes before we're looking at colonizing with probiotics? Will the probiotics colonize in the gut if there's the fungus and the yeast? Or should we be doing digestive enzymes first, or am I completely off the mark?
I would do digestive enzymes if you've got, a child that seemingly has a difficult time digesting food. They're constantly bloated. They're constantly gassy. They eat carbs, they get bloated. Or you do a stool analysis and it shows that there's markers of maldigestion. I think in those particular cases, an enzyme is completely and totally warranted. As far as needing to do it before probiotics, I've never found that necessarily to be the case. So you're just going to have me back. We can,
I think
there's
so.
so much more to talk about. So
thank you for clearing that up. Now, can you tell us about the autism recovery system and how international parents can access and use this to consult with you?
yeah, so the Autism Recovery System, so autismrecoverysystem.com is a biomedical information website. It's a membership site. And so there's course material in there, meaning there's actually an entire biomedical course, there's videos, there's articles, there's other documents that people can access. And there's also a question and answer forum where people anywhere in the world who have internet access can post questions to me on a daily basis that they want on various things, questions they have regarding biomedical intervention. Okay, so it could be, hey, what supplements do you like, to this is my child has this kind of behavior, and we can dialogue through the forum. Now, people who are active members of the Autism Recovery System, if they choose to consult with me privately through my private practice, we'll get some discounts on consultation cost. So but it's not a requirement, right? So people who consult with me, they don't have to be a member of the Autism Recovery System. We just encourage it because it's a lifeline. People post me questions on the weekend, for example, that I can answer. So I have my private practice, which I consult with people all over the world regarding their kids and looking at lab tests and coming up with different intervention strategies. And then I have the Autism Recovery System, which is a website of information that they can interact with me on as well. So the Autism Recovery System is a great site. It's been around for a long time. And again, I look at it as a lifeline. It's an opportunity for people to, get some questions answered, access the material, and then many people choose to, from there, consult with me directly through my private practice.
Dr. Woeller, I know I've been consulting with you for 15 years, and I know that you've been successfully helping international patients over the last 20 years. So thank you very much. I think you made a lot of sense, and I think everyone's going to be exhausted after this science lesson today, but I think you really shed light on DNA analysis, gene testing, and in South Africa, we do have a lab, it's called DNA Analysis, where parents can get that test done. I can tell you, Dr. Woeller, that now with COVID, a lot of parents are complaining that it's very difficult for them to send saliva and urine samples overseas. I had a parent just last week sending a urine sample, and it kind of got stuck. But I still think parents must persist. Don't let that get in your way. Great Plains has been around for so many years, and especially that organic acid test is such an important test to do to get those markers so you can start treating your kids and getting them onto the road to healing and recovery.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being with us today.
And by the way, that DNA test that you have available down there, I've actually seen a copy of it. I think it's a really good profile. I mean, they do a good job graphically in describing things. here real quickly, and then we'll go ahead and end, Alana. This topic on genetics. This is not easy information. Okay, it's all confusing. That's just the nature of genetics. I mean, it's a confusing topic. So parents need to understand that doctors are confused by this information. It's not always intuitive. And, I have to go back and look at the information and refresh myself on some of these things. Because, unless you're immersed in this on a day-to-day basis, it's easy stuff to forget. And so whatever test you do, whether it's the one there in South Africa, whether it's from Great Plains, Doctors Day, whatever, right? It's going to require some self-education. There's just no way around that. And that's just the reality. And so I'm glad you have access to that test, because I think it's a good profile.
Yeah, and I looked very thoroughly at the Max Gen Labs in Texas. Looks, amazing. When I did my youngest son, I'd say about 7 years ago, I tested at a lab called 23andMe. But, Great Plains and Doctors Data also have this test. And just to add to what you've said, I always say to parents that you get an autism diagnosis and then overnight you have to become a chef, a researcher, and a medical doctor.
Right. Yeah, anyway, exactly.
Thank you so much. And we are going to provide your information and how parents can contact you at the end of our podcast. So thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.